Hello, this is Schultz here with the first actual episode of And Thusly Shall We Live. This one, we are going to be talking about the importance of language. Now, this is kind of a weird topic for a podcast that's going to be more centered on like right living and so on and so forth, but eh, we're going to start off light. I don't want to get into the heavy stuff too quick. I don't want to be accused of attracting viewers through rage baiting by choosing very controversial stuff, even though that will come with time. This one is something which I run into a lot more often than I should, as far as running into my list of pet peeves and things that I actually care about a lot, and that is language. And I'm not talking about swearing, not in this case. I'm using language within its definition of the expression or communication of thoughts and feelings by means of vocal sounds and combinations of such sounds to which meaning is attributed, human speech. So you're talking, stuff like that, the way in which we communicate verbally and also non-verbally. Non-verbal communication is also within language. I'm not going to be touching on that per se in this. This is more specifically related to spoken and written word a lot more than it is towards the body language side of things. So the body language side of things is very useful, and it's one of the things which the younger generation, my generation, loses a lot of because we do not interact in person nearly as much as previous generations do. So we have a lot harder time both expressing appropriate nonverbal uh, language and also interpreting that nonverbal language. Um, but yes, and here's a little thing of note, which we'll get back to in a little bit. I'm using a dictionary from the 1960s. If I had an older dictionary, I would have used that, but that's what I had available to me for this. And we'll get around to that a little bit later on. I don't actually have any examples. I should probably have grabbed some, but that will come up in a minute. So, this is what language is. We all speak it. We all have a language of some kind. If you sign, that is a language. Even non-verbally, animals have languages too. They're a little bit different. They're mostly non-verbal. In fact, cats, for example, if it weren't for humans, would be very, very quiet. But like your house cat meowing, there I go doing my own pet peeve, which is something that I don't like, but it's because of enculturation. We'll get around to that in a minute as well. But if you take the example of a house cat, they only meow as much as they do because they know that it's a way of communicating with us, because we will listen to it. But amongst themselves, they do it a lot less often than what we think, because whenever we interact with cats, they tend to do it a lot more. Anyway, so how do languages differ? Well, we have your original, like old world language trees. This is something that my professors brought up in college. Is this picture? They use this picture, and it shows kind of how languages develop. So now we're getting into a bit of the general. There is a path that languages take. There is development that happens and changes which happen. I do understand that. Part of that is natural. Part of that is what you expect and is normal. You can see it's split into two different groups, primary groups, and then you have your Uralic languages, which are just they're kind of weird because they exist in very different places somewhat. Because you have Hungarian, you have Finnish, and yet they come from the same language tree. And it's just kind of interesting how some of these languages geographically interconnect, because actually I learned about this part of language in particular in my geography class in college, because geography in college especially is a lot more than just where things go on a map. It has a lot more focus uh, on how that map defines people groups, how people groups develop and transition across that, and how languages develop and interact across that. Because whenever you get into Europe, there's a lot of mixing of languages and stuff which happens, where you get Yiddish from, which is a Germanic language, but it is not fully Germanic. There are parts of it which come from other places. Um, but this is kind of like the general purpose why the slide is here. It's just to give you an example of languages are very diverse, and they change and develop over time. I'm not saying that all change is impossible or that it shouldn't happen, but this goes into my concerns about language and change. If you look at modern English, it is very, very different than the English of even 100 years ago in a lot of ways. So, what determines the meaning of words? So, I have a book, which I really, really like, called The Elements of Style. I have it here, should have had this bookmarked. But especially in chapter 4 of the book, it has a section on words and expressions that are commonly misused. And some of this is relatively mundane, stuff which has been around for 50 plus years. You think it to be mundane, and to an extent it is. It all seems very simple and straightforward. So, for example, aggravate and irritate. To aggravate means to add on to an already troublesome or vexing matter or condition. So it's taking something which is already a problem and not amplifying it, but adding an additional thing to it. And then you have irritate, and that one means to vex, annoy, or to chafe. So that one is a lot more of your direct, you're bothering me, you're irritating me. It's not you're aggravating me. You can aggravate the problem which is being caused to me, but you are not aggravating me directly. Unless you're considering yourself to be the problem. Then I guess that technically could apply. But in he starts off the chapter saying, many of the words and expressions listed here are not so much bad English as bad style. The commonplaces of careless writing. This is a writing book. This is not a spoken book, but there are elements which are similar and they cross over. So he says, the shape of our language is not rigid. In questions of usage, we have no lawgiver whose word is final. Students whose curiosity is aroused by interpretations that follow or whose doubts are raised will wish to pursue their investigations further. And it provides a list of books for such things. So the emphasis, again, the shape of the language is not rigid. That is something which I'm going to say I agree with, but I also think that there is a certain amount of restraint that should be taken whenever it comes to changing definitions or changing interpretations of connotation and words. Because we've seen over time the lexicon, I don't have studies, I should have brought studies for this. In future ones, I'll hopefully be more prepared. I'm kind of taking advantage of time because we got a bunch of family stuff going on this time of year, and I don't have a lot of time to record. So we're just kind of doing with what I can while I can. And it's going to be a bit more abbreviated than I would like to go into, but honestly, this one's not as big of a deal of topics. But I want us all to be able to consider it. Is the amount of words within the lexicon, the average lexicon. So the average vocabulary of your normal English speaker has decreased by over half since, I would like to say, the 1800s. And a lot of that isn't necessarily like necessary words from the standpoint of how you would talk on the day to day and speak, but there is a certain amount of it which I want to talk about is connotation and specificity. Because if you look at modern English and you look at words which aren't commonly used anymore or are in the archaic category, is that they typically have a word which is still used, which is a similar word, means similar thing, gets the same point across, people will say, but it doesn't necessarily because the connotation is different. It's like aggravate and irritate. Technically, nowadays, you could use irritate where you would normally use aggravate, or so on and so forth. Nowadays, we consider that to be acceptable or normal. But in reality, is that really acceptable or normal? Because you are creating a vagueness in the language whenever you do that. And this goes into a bit of 1984 and Newspeak. So Newspeak in 1984 the general concept of it is that they're dumbing down words. They're making things a lot less specific. So instead of saying, and we run into this in modern day with political correctness. So like instead of addressing someone as sir or ma'am, or saying this saying this man or this woman, they say this person. They're trying to dumb down meaning to make the world gray, basically. Take out definition. Make it both where you can still communicate, but you're communicating less with the same amount of words. And it's like if you were to take the color wheel and use the base colors for everything. So from maroon to pink is all red. Can you do that? Technically. Is it really the same thing, though? No. They're different colors. And it's better to have the specific options available and the ability to use them, because that way you don't have to ask for further clarification or just leave things in a state of kind of limbo where you get the idea of what they're trying to say, but you don't know exactly what it is they're referring to, which tends to happen in conversation. And the other benefit of using more precise verbiage, specifically in the modern era of texting and emails, and where everything is done by type and not by voice, it allows you to provide a certain amount of intonation, which you lose whenever you go away from verbal speech or visual body language in addition to speech. You lose a lot of that whenever you are only typing. And a way to bring some of that back would be to use more specific verbiage. It's not quite built for it because the language was built before that all existed. And that's why emojis have become a thing largely, is to try to provide an additional bit of intonation as to why these things exist. But another example of words that change meaning. Gay. It's a word. It used to mean happy. I grew up thinking that it meant happy. I may be young enough to where technically I should always have known it to mean a male homosexual couple as well, but I did not always. Or queer, for example, that's another word, which it means unsettling. It means to have an unsettled feel, something unsettling, something strange, abnormal. But nowadays it has a reference to a particular community of people. And the reason that I find problematic with that is that now instead of, technically you're not making things, you are both making things more vague and not vague, especially in modern context, but back whenever that was first becoming a thing, whenever gay was still a word that meant happy on the day to day, and then you suddenly introduce homosexual people into it as that also being a meaning, now you have now you have uncertainty, because now you don't know how it's being meant. And that becomes kind of a concern, kind of one of those things which is a bit more questionable, because it starts breaking down a bit of social trust, or not necessarily trust as in honesty related stuff, but trust as in you're less certain with it. It's now become a bit more vague. And then all of a sudden homosexual becomes the improper or the more it's more the improper term. It feels more dirty to the average person than saying gay, which, granted, at the time, we're looking back at a time where it was morally improper to. I still think it is socially and morally improper to be homosexual, but they're using a term to try to distance themselves, an alternate term to try to distance themselves from the stigma, which did exist at the time and in certain communities, the ones that I belong to as well, is still stigmatized as being improper. And they're trying to distance themselves from it so that way they can justify or at least feel quote unquote more comfortable, because they're not denying their reality per se, but they're trying to reword it in a way to where it sounds better than what it actually is, because it still is being homosexual regardless. And that in itself is kind of why language should not change for those reasons, in my opinion. Because if you are dumbing something down to make it sound better, but you are making it more vague, or you're making it more, you're trying to ignore the reality of the situation, you're not really helping things. You're pushing the buck down the road. It's like whenever, I mean, I'm gonna pull an example. Is actually no, I'm not gonna pull that example here. That'll be for a future episode. Um, but basically, this is the general consequences of the thing. And here's another thing, which I didn't quite get to. I should have gotten to it during the language tree, but I might as well get to it now, since we already talked about social trust and clarity and the specificity of words becoming less, just simply less specific in general. And I find that particularly concerning in the case of cultural identity. And I'll explain this now. So I very recently, shall we say, got back into the online sphere after taking a bit of a break from it for a little while. And the one thing I started noticing, and I've noticed it for a little bit, even whenever I was at uni with exchange students and that, but uh, if anything, they were more attuned to their actual culture because they were in a different culture. But you, I see in Europe especially, you run into where people use English. And granted, again, there's always been an international language of some kind. So if you look at back in the day, French was the diplomatic and the legal language, and even the financial language at one point, the language of the international economy. So all of your trade was typically written out in contracts in French. And nowadays, even in modern day, whenever I'm working at the warehouse that I currently work at, although I'm going to be moving on to a different career field here soon, but even working at the warehouse that I work at the moment, a lot of the crates and boxes will have English, and then they will have French, because that is still used as the international legal language. And the international trade language has shifted over to English, but they still retain a large amount of French as being relatively common in, like, for an easy example, French Indochina, that whole area where you have Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and all that. France France was the colonizing power there, and so it was relatively common. Or like in Africa, the two primary colonizing powers were France and England, and then Belgium. And depending on where you are in Belgium, they also spoke French. So it was a bit more of a common. It's a bit more of a common language still, internationally speaking, as well as English. So that's why they still have it. And to an extent, again, it's very useful, very pragmatic to have an international language for commerce and for these things. But whenever it becomes something, but then you had social media. Social media came around. So everybody is now speaking and can talk to somebody in any foreign country you want, anywhere in the world. And this created the thing of, well, everyone better learn a language. And in Europe, because of the Cold War, because of the proliferation of US and British troops on the mainland of Europe, everybody kind of started learning English. It just became the more practical thing to do. Post Cold War, it started becoming more of just a thing because your international power players outside of Russia, outside of China, was the US and the coalition from Western Europe. Like initially, your NATO countries. So, it ends up being in English. That's just kind of what happens, where English becomes the common secondary language for everybody to learn. My concern is that because of how much social media has come about, where now English is the common language. And a lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot because I don't really know how many, but a lot by my standards, as in more than 5 or 6 people that I've ran into from foreign countries say that they do not speak their mother tongue as well as they speak English. And that in of itself is something that I find concerning, mostly because language is a product of culture. And it's kind of both. So language begets culture, culture begets language. There's a certain amount of culture that is added because of the language, but the language itself also is a result of the culture. And whenever you have whenever you have cultures which are forfeiting, for lack of a better term, honestly, forfeiting their language for the sake of ease of communication with people from another country, you're in basically America has enculturated too hard in Europe to an extent because the English language has become so popular there or so common because it's the universal language. So everyone that wants to talk to somebody outside their culture ends up going to it. The problem is that that starts to weaken in my this is a bit more theory than actual fact at the moment, but this is my opinion as to why Europe is having cultural issues. And I don't mean cultural issues like morality, I'm talking more cultural stability, is because whenever you influx a large number of people, the migrant crisis, as they call it, uh, there's other words to use for it, which I will probably get to in a later one, which are going to be a lot more specific and a lot more abrasive. But pretty much the issue that you run into is that the local culture is weaker than the culture which is emigrating into your country. So all of a sudden, your weakened culture, weakened both because of moral reasons, I will add that in there, and your cultural identity, so the individual person within, say, the the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, France, Britain, their identity and their culture is weak. And on average, I'm not saying on the whole, and people start to dig back into their culture whenever hard times come about because it's a way of creating mental stability, is to kind of reaffirm your identity and what you remember. So there is still hope. I'm not saying there's no hope, but I'm saying that the reason why everything got so bad, it has been so bad in Europe, is because they do not harbor their own identity and hold it up as something good and important. And also because a part of that, in my opinion, is because of language, because they took over English as being almost, if not actually, more important than their own language. And the youth, because they interact online so much, they use English so much more on the internet side of things that it suddenly becomes a problem of a literal identity problem where they identify more with your average English speaker who, in the case of Europe, speaks better English than Americans most of the time. And that causes issues. And I can't tell you how honestly heartbreaking it is whenever I see people from cultures which I appreciate a lot and I studied saying that I barely speak my own language. I barely speak Dutch, or I barely speak German, or I barely speak French anymore. Granted, there's not that many of that with France because they still have a they have France is known for having their certain air about them. So that one is a bit. I run into that one a bit less than I do Dutch, German, Belgium, or Belgian Dutch anyway, and more centered in Central and Eastern Europe actually. But overall, it's really disheartening that it's come to a point where the young don't see themselves necessarily in the same cultural light that I feel that they should. And that can lead to revolution in a lot of cases. It can lead to radicalization of generations because they become culturally vulnerable. And so people will come along and sell them a message and bring them into a specific culture or a specific path, because into a specific movement, because they are culturally weak on their own. And anyway, back to the point is that back to the point that I was trying to make is you have uh, whenever you have a group of people move in which is more culturally strong than you are tantamount equivocating all of this to a manner of a hostile takeover. Because a whenever you have large family groups from Muslim countries emigrate into a Western country which has gone through, which basically is in a state of very severe decadence, on the moral front. Decadence meaning the degradation of morals within a successful society, basically, which is what happened to Rome. That's why Rome fell. And Rome didn't fall due to a war. Rome fell because it made everyone else so Roman that being Roman wasn't special anymore. And the vast empire that it had just started to just leave. I mean, that's like the short version. There's more to it than just that, but that's like the more simple way of saying it, without going into essays upon essays of the stuff. Um, and that's kind of what Europe is dealing with right now. And I say there's hope, and I do mean that because they can still regain their cultural identity. It's not trashed. Germany probably is the best example of a country which has struggled with this the most because of World War II and everything that happened, which in fact, the only reason that the Nazis were able to take power as much as they did is because there was a weak cultural identity in Germany after World War One, leading into all that. Because Germany was a relatively new country. Because back, they weren't even around whenever the Civil War happened. Germany didn't exist as a unified nation until after the Civil War ended in America. And being around for less than 100 years, losing a major conflict and a majority of your young working generation of males, you run into a vast array of stressors on your culture all in one go. And you also remove the monarchy, which especially within a nation state like Germany was at the time, is probably your most stabilizing factor you have. You are ripe for revolution. And the Weimar Republic didn't help a lot of things. Plus, you also had the Great Depression, so you had economic factors in there as well. But it all comes back around to the cultural element of your cultural identity. And in America, it's a bit different because I mean, it's not any different because we still are American and we have a cultural identity as that, as being an American. But it is a little bit different because we don't have the same kind of history. Because if I were to go back in my family history, I'm only my family history has only been American for 140 years roughly, somewhere around there. Granted, World War One, most German families leaned very heavily into being American because they didn't want to be ostracized by the rest of Americans, because a lot of Americans very strongly hated the Germans during World War One because of the propaganda campaigns and everything that Woodrow Wilson put on. But that again is like, the language thing is kind of like not the biggest issue in the world until it comes around to where it takes over your own culture. And that's where I like the clarity and everything like that. I still consider that important. I still think that the evolution of language, because it does change over time. There's new words that exist today that didn't exist back then. There's new slang terms which come and go, which I'm fine with. I get that. There's some words which we just don't use because we don't use the equipment or material which we used to use. And I get that. That makes sense. But whenever you're starting to vacate using words simply for the sake of simplification of the lexicon, you start running into the risk of you're losing your clarity. You're losing basic human interaction, which builds social trust, because you weaken the language. There's an example, and again, spoken word does not have to be nearly as proper as written word should be. In Latin, even, you have a vulgar Latin, and you have your more legal, your official Latin, which most people learn whenever they learn Latin. Not that many people actually learn the vulgar Latin side of it, because most Latin that's used today is all done in written form. But the vulgar Latin was actually very significantly different from the written form, and that is just because running your spoken word through all these checks that you have to do with the written just doesn't really work on a fundamental level. I So there is a certain difference given to the spoken word, and I get that, and I appreciate that. But whenever you're throwing away whole words, whole concepts, you start running into bigger issues. And that's just something that I want to bring is to think about whenever we're covering a lot of this stuff, is that something as simple as language, which we use on an everyday and we don't think about, I don't think about. I do a lot of things which do personally irk me, especially whenever written. But I use them in spoken largely because that's just kind of what everyone does, and it's hard to on the fly think properly about things. And this is something which can only really be fixed through the education system. And there's a lot of issues with that. I do want to talk about the current problems in the American education system at some point, because again, the American education system, I don't even really know that well because I was homeschooled, but I do have at least a good idea of it because I interact with people from it on the regular, and I know several people who are teachers. So again, education, we go from there. Dictionaries. Here's my recommendation to all of you listening. Buy it, go to some secondhand store, find a dictionary that's from before the 70s and buy it. And use that dictionary. It won't have some of your modern terms, so again, you can use modern dictionaries for that. But I recommend buying an older dictionary because the definitions used for words have changed over time. And it is not always for the better. And in fact, I would say a lot of the times it's for the worse because they've changed meanings of things, like especially nowadays whenever a pandemic happened, they changed the definition of pandemic, they changed the definition of what a recession was, things like that, because now everything's stored on Google, everything can be changed by whoever's pulling the strings. It does not take that much effort to, and whenever people, this is one thing that I will say I actually appreciate about like Plato, Socrates era and all that philosophy from back then, is the idea that I appreciate the concept more than I do necessarily not writing stuff down. But back then, there was this thought of why would you write something down? Because that's lazy to write stuff down, because then you don't have to remember it. And I wholly understand nowadays why that exists and why that plane of thinking is. I don't say don't write stuff down, but don't use Google for everything. Try to pick up a book about something instead of looking at Google for everything, because you're relying on something which can be changed in an instant, something which is inherently of itself moldable, like Play-Doh. It never hardens. It does not get molded and turned to stone. It stays in the moldable state and can be fashioned by people, and you don't know who those people are. A book has an author. A book doesn't change unless it gets republished. But if you have the physical book, you have it in its state as it exists. And that in of itself is really, really important whenever it comes to research and it comes to certainty. And that's honestly what this boils down to at the end of the day, is that this all comes back to certainty. Is there really a solution to this problem, though? I do not know that. I can hope the education system can fix things, but I don't know how to fix the education system, because that requires the government, that requires a whole lot of other things, and then every country is a little bit different with how that works. I would say probably some of the more important things, especially for Europe, is to have the government reinvest into culture, into their own culture. Yes, even in Germany, into their own culture. There's a lot of culture that exists before the 40s, in the imperial era, back in the 1880s, 1890s. Sure, you can theoretically argue that led to World War One, but that didn't really lead to World War One. What led to World War One was a lot more related to the way the governments interacted with each other than the culture of the people. And at least that's my 2 cents, particularly on World War One. World War Two culture was more heavily involved, especially in Germany's case. But again, that was weakened as a result of World War One. And a lot of people today will agree that in World War One, Germany got off harder than they should have. But that's aside the point. That's another discussion for another day. But basically, it's one of those things is to be mindful of and to think about is why we are where we are, and whether it's good that we are in the state of language being broken down. Is it a good thing that we're here? I do not really feel that it is a good thing. And just how to do it. I do not know how to fix this fully. I have ideas, but it's comes down to what us as individuals, the small things, as J.R.R. Tolkien put it, it's the small things, not the big things, which actually matter. Because if we can be good with our own lives and the way that we interact within our culture, it can and will affect the greater culture at large. And we have to start where we can and influence the people that we can influence. Everything beyond that is kind of out of our control unless one of us ends up being a politician or someone in an education system somewhere that's capable of doing something. And that's pretty much all she wrote for today, I guess. I don't have really anything else to say about that. Be reasonable with your expectations. This is not like your permission slip to become a grammar Nazi. But I mean, if you're that way anyway, by all means, continue being so. As long as you don't get too mad at your friends whenever they use 5 verbal pauses in the middle of a written text. And also hydrate, people. Water is good for the brain. Water is good for the brain. Bit of fat is good for the brain. Just take care. Stay safe. Have a good one.